Fairey Swordfish, named for the fish with a sword on its face, was a biplane torpedo bomber that was designed by the Fairey Aviation Company. And I get really mad whenever I read articles about this plane, because a lot of people seem to keep saying and keep thinking that the Fairey Swordfish, oh my goodness, it was an obsolete World War I plane that served during World War II. It was amazing, wonderful. Can't believe such an old plane from World War I would have served at that time and been successful. And stop saying that, please. It's wrong. The Swordfish does not originate from World War I at all. Yes, it is a biplane, which were used very much during World War I, but the Swordfish itself originates from the 1930s, far after World War I was over, but still predating World War II by a few years. And it is true to say that by the time World War II started, it was thought that the Swordfish was pretty outdated, and yet they still had an impressive amount of success. In fact, they sank a greater tonnage of Axis shipping than any other Allied aircraft during the war. How could this plucky little biplane actually pull that off? Well, it has to do mostly with the theaters they were thrown into, as well as clever deployment by the British. You couldn't just throw a Swordfish out anywhere and expect it to do well, because they wouldn't. They had a crew of 3, a pilot, observer, and a radio operator, as well as a rear gunner. The third guy did both of those things, although the observer's position was sometimes replaced with an auxiliary fuel tank. They had a length of 35 feet 8 inches, a wingspan of 45 feet 6 inches, a width of 17 feet 3 inches, a height of 12 feet 4 inches, and a gross weight of 7,580 pounds. They were powered by a single Bristol 3M3 9-cylinder air-cooled radial piston engine, rated for 690 horsepower. The propellers were 3-bladed, metal fixed-pitch propellers, and they could fly at a blistering pace of 143 miles per hour. That was while carrying a torpedo, so when they dropped their ordnance they could go a bit faster, but they were still slow as molasses. And they did have some defensive armament because of this. They had one fixed forward-firing 7.7mm Vickers machine gun in the upper right fuselage. They also had a rear gun, another single 7.7mm Lewis or Vickers K machine gun. And in addition to torpedoes, they could also carry mines, bombs, or rockets if needed. But the point is that based on these statistics, it's pretty clear that, yeah, how did this thing get to be successful? Like, in World War II? 143 miles per hour? That is so unreasonably slow. I mean, heck, the Devastators were thrown out the window pretty early in the conflict due to being not up to snuff, and they could fly a little over 200 miles per hour, so how in the world did the British get away with utilizing the Swordfish? Well, it is as I said. Generally it was clever deployment, as well as some very brave pilots. The origins of the Swordfish go back to 1933, when the company Fairey was looking to build a new 3-seat naval aircraft, intended for both aerial reconnaissance and to be a torpedo bomber. Internally, it was designated the TSR-1, and from the get-go, it was meant to be a biplane. Initially, it was actually a self-financed private venture, while customers for the type were sought. And development on it was actually parallel to their activities working on the Air Ministry's specification S9/30, for which they were working on a separate but relatively similar aircraft, powered by a different engine, as well as having a different fin and rudder configuration. Significant contributions to the TSR-1 came from another one of their independent design work on a proposed aircraft for the Greek Naval Air Service, which had requested replacements for the Fairey 3F, as well as other specifications for the British Air Ministry, M1/30 and S9/30. Eventually, Greece decided to go a different direction, and Fairey informed the Air Ministry that they had been working on that for them, and proposed their own design for their requirements for a spotter reconnaissance aircraft. In 1934, the Air Ministry decided to issue a more advanced specification, S15/33, which would formally add the torpedo bomber role, thereby allowing Fairey to push the TSR-1 forward. On March 21st, 1933, the initial prototype conducted her maiden flight from Great West Aerodrome in Heathrow. The prototype would conduct several flights, though would be eventually lost on September 11th, 1933, during a series of spin tests, from which it was realized she couldn't recover, though the pilot was able to survive. Prior to that particular hiccup, the prototype actually had very favorable performance, so Fairey pushed forward, producing another prototype, dubbed TSR-2, which had been specially developed to conform with the newly issued specification S-15/33. That prototype first took to the skies on April 17, 1934. She was equipped with a more powerful model of the original Pegasus engine, as well as an additional bay within the rear fuselage to counteract the spin tendencies that had destroyed the first prototype, and the upper wing was slightly swept back to account for the increased length of the fuselage, along with some other minor tweaks here and there. They also tested this prototype with a twin-float undercarriage in place of the original landing gear, and it was discovered that the type could indeed handle flying with floats, as well as landing on the water. In 1935, following the successful completion of testing, an initial pre-production order for 3 of the aircraft was placed by the Air Ministry, and it was at that point the TSR-2 finally received her formal name, Swordfish. The pre-production versions differed rather little from the prototype, with the exception of the addition of a 3-bladed Fairey Reed propeller, in place of the 2-bladed one the prototype used. The first pre-production Swordfish made her maiden flight on December 31st, 1935, and on February 19th, 1936, the second one became the first to be delivered. The Fleet Air Arm was quite happy with the pre-production planes, and as such, in early 1936, an initial production contract for 68 Swordfish was received, dubbed the Swordfish 1s. They were manufactured by Fairey in Hayes, West London, and entered service with the Fleet Air Arm in July of 1936, and production would continue on the planes well into World War II. In fact, it wouldn't be ceased until August 18th of 1944, with Blackburn aircraft also being contracted to produce the planes by the Admiralty, as they desperately needed more of them. For 2 years, during the late 1930s, the Swordfish was actually the only torpedo bomber aircraft that the Fleet Air Arm had, and by the eve of war, the Fleet Air Arm, which had been transferred to Royal Navy control, had 13 operational squadrons equipped with the Swordfish 1. There were also 3 flights of Swordfish equipped with floats for use in catapult-equipped warships. When the war broke out, 26 FAA squadrons were equipped with the Swordfish, and 20 second-line squadrons also had them. But how was the fleet going to operate with this particular plane? I mean, even at the time, they had to know that it was a little subpar. And yes, it wasn't like the British weren't aware that the Swordfish would need a replacement. In fact, Fairey had already been working on a follow-up, the Albacore. But the Albacore would in fact be withdrawn before the Swordfish would be, and there were a few reasons for that. For one thing, the Swordfish could be utilized pretty well even in their somewhat subpar state. They saw service in the Norwegian campaign, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, as well as the home front. And pretty much every time they were thrown out there, it was always in a situation where fighter cover was not something the fleet was necessarily worried about, because that's where the Swordfish fell really short. If there were enemy fighters around and they had no escorts, they were eaten alive. In fact, this exact thing did happen in February of 1942, when the German naval fleet conducted a movement known as the Channel Dash. 6 Swordfish were sent out to intercept 2 of the German battleships as they traversed the English Channel, but when they arrived and commenced the initial attack run, they were intercepted by 15 Bf-109s. The Swordfish stood no chance against 109s. They were ripped apart, and I mean that quite literally. All the Swordfish were shot down, every single one, and they did no damage to the ships. 13 of the 18 Swordfish crew involved were killed. It was a complete disaster, but that didn't mean the Swordfish was useless. Early in the war, they actually did alright, mostly being deployed in places where there just wasn't a lot of fighter cover from the Luftwaffe, because the thing about the Swordfish was this: had they been in a place where the enemy navy had significant fighter presence, they would have been well, really bad, frankly. But the Swordfish weren't deployed in the Pacific, where the Devastators were, which had to contend with Zeros, which destroyed them, horrifically. But the Swordfish never had to worry about that because Germany did not have a functional carrier, so the only planes they had to be afraid of were the ones taking off from land. If the Royal Navy deployed them in places where that was not likely, like over the ocean, then they only had to deal with anti-aircraft fire, and interestingly enough, the Swordfish was highly maneuverable, and able to deal with stiff resistance, even from heavy anti-aircraft guns. It probably helped that especially early in the war, a lot of warships didn't have a lot of anti-aircraft guns. They had some, but not a lot. And this was super relevant when they were fighting the Bismarck. That incident is likely one of the biggest Swordfish claims to fame. They were integral in destroying her. They didn't actually sink her, but they did cripple her. 2 flights of Swordfish slowed Bismarck down, with one of the second flight's torpedoes jamming her rudder, making her completely unmaneuverable and allowing the Royal Navy to move in and sink her. One theory regarding why the Bismarck failed to shoot down any of the attacking Swordfish is that the crews would have trained on faster moving planes, but the Swordfish was so slow that they may have been leading the shots too much. Either way though, it was a tremendous victory for the Royal Navy, as well as this outdated little biplane. But as time went on, they started being used less and less because, well, for one thing, the war would eventually move mostly on land, and it was a bit more dangerous there because there would be enemy fighters, which would destroy Swordfish easily. They also did not dare deploy them in the Pacific, ever. At least not to any significant extent. Towards the end of the war, they decided to get creative with them again, because the other thing about the Swordfish is that they were remarkably flexible. Later iterations would even have radar introduced, and this was relevant because they started using them for anti-submarine duties, some of those missions being conducted at night, and they were exceedingly good at that. The nice thing about submarines is that they, generally, don't have a lot of anti-aircraft guns. Sometimes not at all, which meant that they couldn't shoot back at the Swordfish if they were caught by them. And the Swordfish did an incredible job sinking U-boats. They did that a lot, in fact. On May 23rd, in particular, of 1943, Swordfish managed to destroy German submarine U-752 off the coast of Ireland. But they didn't use torpedoes, they used rockets. And it was the first kill achieved with that particular type of weapon. Because of their remarkable flexibility and adaptability, the Swordfish stuck around a lot longer than one would think, though nothing lasts forever. Eventually they had to be phased out, but not until the very tail end of World War II. They were retired on May 21st, 1945, with over 2,000 of them being produced. Their service in the face of adversity has made them many fans, because by all accounts, they shouldn't have been as successful as they were. But because of clever deployment, as well as the accommodating and flexible nature of the planes, it meant that for the bulk of it, even when they had a replacement for them, the British still found use for their loyal Swordfish. And to date, there are multiple examples still in preservation. A couple are even airworthy, while many are in static display. Some are located in Canada, one is in Malta, a few are in the United Kingdom, and at least one, a Swordfish 4, is here in the United States, at the American Air Power Heritage Museum of the Commemorative Air Force in Dallas, Texas. Their story is one of overcoming adversity, doing far more than anyone would have expected or thought possible. They're nicknamed Stringbags because of their outdated design, but the nickname was not given out of loathing for them. In fact, many pilots adored their Swordfish, and it's likely that fans of this particular plane will sing their praises for years to come. And with that, a special thank you goes out to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Brian, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Lord Off 444, Murder Drones Doll, A Person 723, Royal Hudson 2860, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Red Lion, NS Productions 8104, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Ohio Trucker 1, Andrew Bowen, Josh Johnson, Hayden DeGrow, Caleb Rainwaters, Prez Drenton, Master of None, Oklahoma Hot Rail, Liam Wright, Mr. Sleepy, Travis Dolinsky, Jared Brussel, Joshua Long, Hannah Bird, Amtrak 2024 Productions, Tommy Rossini, That Guy with a Beard, Ben McCullough, Panzer Kitson 131-232, Mark Holding, Dr. Racer 78, and G Wiz. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fun farewell.